Hello, everyone. This is the 18th episode of the Soccernostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles, and I am joined by Paul from Shipley in England. For this episode, we are joined by Scottish author Mr. Andy Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell is the author of books such as Arthur Kinnaird, First Lord of Football, 1824, The World's First Football Club, Come Away the Heather, Story of Dunblane Football Club, 1879-1914, and First Elevens, The Birth of International Football and the Men Who Made It Happen. Welcome, Mr. Mitchell, and thank you for participating in this interview.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join you.
Thank you. Whenever we have a new guest, we always start off with the first question. What was your first memory of football?
Well, it's a very clear memory because it was 50 years ago this year. I went to my first football match. I was brought up in Edinburgh, and some of my friends down the street had already started going to football, and they took me to Easter Road in October 1970 to watch Hibs play Hearts in the East of Scotland Shield final. And in my mind's eye, I can still see John Blackley running up to take the penalty that was the only goal of the match. So the 1-0 victory for Hibs in the East of Scotland Shield. And I've been going to football ever since. It's been a very strong part of my life, and I've become quite obsessed by it.
Thank you, Andy, and also thank you for joining us. Our follow-up question is always, what's your favourite World Cup?
Yeah, I was thinking about this. As a Scotland fan, it's hard to have a favourite World Cup because we haven't won it yet. So I've got to look at it from a different perspective in terms of my own personal experience. And for me, my favourite is probably 1986, simply because it's the only one I've been to as a fan. I travelled over to Mexico and I saw Scotland's 3 matches in Mexico, Neza and Querétaro. And I had a fabulous time. I just loved the whole atmosphere around the World Cup, meeting people from all around the world. You never know who you're going to bump into, and it was just a lovely, lovely atmosphere. I can't really say the same about the football I witnessed, but I enjoyed it. It was a good experience. And for me, that World Cup stands out simply because it was just the ability to be part of it, to feel like this was a big adventure. And the only other World Cup I've been to was 98, but I was working at it as the Scotland team press officer. So it's a very different perspective, not quite so enjoyable because you're stuck in a hotel or a training ground most of the time. And although you're close to the action on match day, the rest of the time you're really kind of divorced from the atmosphere and the reality of what's going on round about you. And all the other World Cups I've just seen on TV, so that's not really quite so much fun. So 86 for me.
In the recent months, there has been some renewed interest in Arthur Kinnaird, the subject of one of your books, because of the Netflix series The English Game. And as we get deeper in this interview, we'll also touch up on your involvement in the series. Most football historians have heard of Lord Kinnaird for his number of FA Cup wins, 5, which was only broken in 2010 by Ashley Cole. Can you describe him and his importance to the development of the game?
Yeah, Kinnaird was one of the absolutely key figures in developing football. And although that statistic about winning the FA Cup 5 times and playing in 9 finals is part of the story, you also have to look at his lifelong contribution to the game. When he first played association football when he left school in 1865 and was involved in football for the rest of his life. He joined the FA committee when he was still a student, and he was 55 years on the FA council in various positions, rising to president. So he was an integral part of football all the way from sort of the park, sort of ramble around the play parks of London and southern England, all the way to the construction of Wembley. And so he saw everything, the transition from amateurism to professionalism, the developments of the laws of the game, the popularity of football, just sweeping the country and then sweeping the world. So he was a man who had an oversight of everything that made football what it is today. But what makes him particularly fascinating for me is everything else he did in his life. So he was a philanthropist and devoted huge amounts of time and money to all sorts of charitable causes. He ran all sorts of organizations, from the YMCA, the YWCA. He was just involved in so many different things. And between all that, he managed to hold down a full-time job as the director of a bank. And thrown for good measure, he inherited a title and an estate. So he became Lord Kinnaird halfway through his life. So fascinating character on all sorts of different directions. And that's basically why I decided to write a book about him. That was my first book nearly 10 years ago.
Football fans today can't fathom football players doing anything other than actually playing. But Kinnaird, and he wasn't alone, he was simultaneously playing and an administrator. How was he regarded in that role, the administrative role that he undertook?
I think, to a large extent, that was the normal situation in those days. And I was looking up in 1868, when Kinnaird first joined the FA committee to sort of running the national game, a committee of 12 men. He was 21 years old, a student at Oxford, but he wasn't the youngest. The youngest was a 19-year-old guy who had come from Westminster School. So it was very much a young man's game. And if you think about football administrators today, they tend to be aging, white, middle-class men who wear suits. But that's because they've spent a lifetime in football building up to that. In the 1860s, you didn't have that experience because association football, as created by the FA, was brand new. It had only just started. So the only people who knew the game were those who played it. So when the FA doubled its committee size in 1868 and took on another 6 recruits, the oldest of those recruits was 26 years old. Kinnaird was 21, and the youngest was 19, as I said. So being an administrator and a player was normal at that time. And inevitably, a lot of people lost interest, or their job took over, or they got married and got involved in family life. But that never seemed to affect Kinnaird. He stayed in position throughout the rest of his life and through most of his playing career as well, because he didn't really give up playing serious football until his FA Cup final defeat in 1883. And he still carried on playing for a good decade after that. So he managed to dovetail playing football and being an administrator. And I think that stood him in good stead, because nobody could say he didn't understand the game, which is a pretty common accusation for football administrators today. So I think that was a good move by him, and a good move by football to keep him on board, to make use of his experience and his great knowledge in the game.
Though English-born, Arthur Kinnaird earned a solitary cap for Scotland playing versus England in the second ever international on March 8, 1873. Can you talk about this and how he was selected, and in general his views on this nascent international football?
Yeah, that was 1873, but in a way you have to go back to 1870 to talk about Kinnaird's involvement. Because before there were true and acknowledged international football matches between Scotland and England, there was a series of unofficial games in London, basically between English people living in London and Scottish people living in London who were playing association football at that time. And Kinnaird and some other Scots on the FA committee were right behind those matches, which kind of set the template for international football to begin. And although the there's no way they can be considered as true internationals. They were certainly fought very fiercely, as they would today, because people are very proud of their national heritage and enjoy that rivalry. So in March 1870 was the first of the unofficial internationals, and Kinnaird played in that game. He helped to select the Scotland team. The game ended in a 1-1 draw, so honours were even. And he played in a couple more of those matches the following year. So those unofficial internationals were really the catalyst for full international football to start. And bizarrely enough, rugby football got there first, because they said these unofficial games were nothing like the true thing, were shouldn't be recognised. So they got their act together in 1871. And then in 1872, there was a formal challenge from the FA through Charles Alcock to footballers in Scotland. So in November 1872, Queen's Park Football Club took up that challenge. They selected the team for the first international against England, which was a 0-0 draw. And they made a bit of money out of that match from gate receipts. But when it came to the return match in March 1873, Queen's Park didn't have enough money to send their entire team to London. So they only had enough for 8 return rail fares. So they needed reinforcements, and they already knew of some of the key players in London. Kinnaird was well known as a prominent player and well known as being Scottish. So Queen's Park invited Kinnaird and 2 others living in London to play for the team known as Scotland in March 1873. And therefore he became a Scotland internationalist in that match, which England won 4-2. A week after that match, the Scottish Football Association was founded, because the first 2 games were entirely organised and managed by Queen's Park Football Club. So when the Scottish FA was founded, they took the decision, not surprisingly, that from now on, Scotland teams should be for Scots living and playing in Scotland. So that basically kiboshed any future possibilities of Kinnaird winning any more caps. So even though his top-level career continued for another 10 years, he was never considered for another international cap. And in fact, it wasn't until 1896 that the Scottish FA decided that perhaps they could bolster their team by selecting players who were playing in England. But until that time, so for the first 20 plus years of Scottish international football, it was only people who lived in Scotland who were playing for Scottish clubs who were selected for the Scottish national team. So from Kinnaird's perspective, I'm sure he fully understood that decision and was not at all perturbed or upset by it. But that explains why he was only ever selected once.
Now, was this decision by the Scottish FA, was this so that Queen's Park would not usurp their authority? Was that the sole reason, or was there more to it?
It was essentially so that the authority over Scottish football would be spread between a number of clubs. I mean, Queen's Park was the first Scottish club to adopt association football. And they were very much respected for that. They were seen as the premier club. But as football started to grow rapidly in the early 1870s, then you had to acknowledge the fact that there were a lot of other clubs starting up who were quite good as well. And so the Scottish FA was started not only for international football, but also to set up the Scottish Cup. They'd seen the success of the English FA Cup, and so within their first year of operation, they established the Scottish FA Cup. And Queen's Park won that tournament. In fact, they won the first 3 tournaments. But they needed competition. So that was effectively the job of the Scottish FA, they acknowledged the role in Queen's Park in getting association football started in Scotland, but they also had to acknowledge the fact that there were a lot of other people and other clubs involved in the game. So that explains some of the background to that.
And at that time, the 1870s and going into the 1880s, how did the game develop in Scotland compared to in England, and not just the organisation of the league, but were there significant differences in tactics and style of play?
Yes, there were huge differences in tactics and style, and for quite complex historical reasons. And if you bear with me, I'll try and explain some of the reasons for that. When association football was launched in 1863, it was a coming together of a number of different people from a variety of backgrounds who understood football as it was played in their own school or in their own vicinity. And they agreed a kind of compromise set of rules. But some of the more prominent players had come from public schools like Eton, Westminster, Winchester, and so on, Harrow in particular, where the game was played effectively almost as a trial of strength, where you had to put up with hard knocks because it made you a man. And the game of football was essentially played with the ball at your feet. You ran forward with it until such time as you were tackled. And you had structures of people to back you up. But effectively, the stronger players, the bigger players were at an advantage to get through there. Contrast that within Scotland, where football has a very long heritage, not particularly well recorded, but football was played in Scotland long before 1863, but not on that basis. We didn't have the public school system here, and the fee-paying schools tended to gravitate towards playing rugby football. So for the common man playing what they understood at football, it was seen as a combination game of teamwork, where you could achieve success by working together, where you could pass the ball, and that was a way to win games, to score goals. And you had this fascinating situation when these two different styles came together for the first time in 1872. There were two significant matches. First of all, the FA Cup semi-final between Wanderers and Queen's Park in the spring of 1872, and then Scotland against England in the first international in November 1872. Now, both those games ended 0-0. Despite the differing styles, and despite the fact that most people assumed that the English teams would be the favourites and would dominate. And the reason for that is that the two styles cancelled each other out. And I did some analysis of the Scotland team that played England, and there were a whole range of factors which saw that the Scotland team were on average lighter, shorter than the English. They even had a much smaller life expectancy because of their different backgrounds. They weren't well fed and in respectable, safe jobs like a lot of the English ones were. So man to man, physically, they could not succeed at beating the English playing the dribbling game, where you put your head down, used your strength and used your body to force your way through. But they countered that with basically going round the English, passing the ball. And it took some time to understand that those differences were pretty fundamental. And the outcome of that was, again, pretty important for the development of association football. And he saw that through the 1870s in a number of factors. So that the traditional English style of football soon became, if not discredited, it soon became apparent that it was not as good as the Scottish traditional style. And by the end of the 1870s, association football in Scotland was far, far superior to that in England, because they had cracked the whole ethos of using the passing game to overcome the dribbling game. And that was reflected in the scores of some of the international matches between Scotland and England. Scores like 7-2 for Scotland, 6-1, 5-1. So that just emphasised the gap and the difference between the two. And I'm sure we'll come back to this later, but that then led on to the desire of English clubs to get some Scots in their team, because the Scots had this sort of secret method and ability to pass the ball and therefore make your team successful. So that's it in a kind of nutshell. And essentially the Scots, when they started playing association football, didn't have the baggage of the English public school types who just knew that strength would triumph and it would make you a man. And that was not a very good way of winning football matches. So there you are in a nutshell.
Thank you. And is that the origin of the term the Scotch professors to reflect, maybe more scientific, technical approach to the game?
Yeah, that arose in the 1880s, perhaps prompted by the first pseudo-professionals to go south, like Fergie Souter, and Jimmy Love at Darwin, Hugh McIntyre and others at Blackburn Rovers, and then a bit of a flood of others elsewhere. They were called Scotch professors, partly on the basis of their ability and knowledge, but also slightly disparagingly that they were professors in the terms of mercenaries and that they could be bought.
Okay.
To improve your chances and your playing ability.
How did the game evolve from being an upper-class sport played solely by upper-class gentlemen and the public schools to one for the masses?
Well, the short answer is it didn't. It wasn't an upper-class sport. Football has been played by all sorts of classes or all sorts of people in England and Scotland and elsewhere for a very long time. But what the upper class types did in 1863 was form an association. And with the Victorian love for regulation and writing things down and codes of behaviour and so on, they wrote down the rules. But football's been played for hundreds of years by all sorts of people, and far from being just the upper class types. And I think they perhaps rewrote their own history by saying that we invented the game, but that is totally untrue. All they did was form an association, and within 15, 20 years, the upper class types, as you call them, who started the game, had been found out as the mass of population took over the game. So the football by the end of the 19th century was very much the working man's game, and those who had written the rules had very much been pushed to the background.
So that's just a stereotype, like cultural stereotype, that was how the upper class started the game, but then it became for the masses. That's just not necessarily true.
That's my opinion, yes.
Okay.
And I think most football historians agree with that football was perhaps temporarily loaned to the Etonians and Harrovians and so on, because they had the money, the leisure time, and the organizational ability to come up with a set of rules. But once those rules were pushed out to the wider populace, the balance very quickly shifted and went back to the common people.
How did this affect the relationship between the Football Association when the Football League came into being a little bit later on? Was there tension between the two?
I think initially there was tension simply because of this suspicion about money coming into the game. Because until the 1880s, the game had been run very much from London, and they allowed a little bit of input from the regional associations and from Sheffield and so on. but it was still essentially an amateur game, and run by amateurs and played by amateurs. So when the money started to come into football, that created initially a tension as to whether this money should be allowed in the game, and that led to all the struggles to allow professionalism, which was finally allowed in 1885, with certain restrictions at the time. And then once professionalism was established, clubs themselves, who were professional, needed to have a guaranteed source of income so they could pay their players. And gate money was the background to that. But if you got knocked out of a cup by accident, or if you got drawn against another big team in the first round, you had a bad season, that was a very precarious way to run a business. And football was becoming run more and more as a business at that time. So that is basically the background to the formation of the Football League in 1888. It was to provide a guaranteed fixture list for the bigger clubs, who were essentially all north of England clubs. Geographically, they came from quite a small area, but it meant that they could have their guaranteed source of income, and at the same time, they could take part in cup competitions for a bit of excitement, and with the big prize still being the FA Cup. But a recognition that the FA Cup was a precarious competition to enter, and if you couldn't maintain your income from that, then you could get into severe financial trouble. So I wouldn't say there's particularly a tension between the FA and the Football League. It was more a recognition that this was the new reality of professional football. And the FA was very keen to ensure that the Football League didn't go off and do its own thing, but still came under that umbrella of the national organisation of the game. And they had a sort of reasonably good compromise in that they agreed that was how the game should be organised.
Had there been a significant danger of a breakaway before that, when professionalism was first coming about?
Yes, there was. And there was a huge struggle going on in 1883, 84, 85, as the professional clubs continued to threaten the FA and say, look, if you do not allow this, we will go and create our own game. And that's very much what happened in rugby the following decade, which ended up with a very bitter split between rugby union, which was amateur, and rugby league, which was professional. And you ended up with not just a split, but in fact two different codes of playing, not just amateur professional, but they changed the rules so that they went their own separate ways. Now, football was at great risk of that happening in the 1880s. But you had pragmatists like Arthur Kinnaird and Charles Alcock, who recognised that this was inevitable, and it was far better to regulate the game from within than to allow these people to split up and do their own thing. So they had to win over their own people. The arguments with the amateurs who wanted to keep the game amateur, and it was a long and bitter struggle, but they got there in the end. So in the summer, I think it was 1885, that professionalism was finally approved and agreed upon by the FA.
Sociologically, why do you think the population at large gravitated to the sport? And was this rise in interest the same in Scotland as it was in England?
Well, why is football popular? I mean, that's still the same question today. Why is it the world's most popular sport? Why are we doing this podcast? It's because it holds a fascination. It's an easy game to understand. It's an easy game to play. And you don't need expensive equipment. That's essentially the background to football's popularity above pretty much all other sports. But if you go back to the early days of the 1870s and 1880s, football had an exponential rise from being just a park pastime to a major commercial enterprise. And I think that expansion was perhaps more prominent more quickly in Scotland. It's very hard to explain why, but if you look at the rise in the number of clubs in Scotland in the 1870s, it was much more rapid than in England. If you look at the number of entrants to the Scottish Cup, despite Scotland being a much smaller country than England, about a tenth of the population, by the end of the 1870s, the Scottish Cup had far more entries than the English FA Cup. So that shows that football had, I suppose, just taken the public imagination, and very, very rapidly, everybody wanted to play it. And there was a huge number of football players within 10 years or so of football getting going in Scotland. In England, it was a bit more slow and measured. I think partly because of this public school, upper class attitude in London. They didn't really reach out to the masses, as happened in Scotland. So I think they wanted to keep it relatively exclusive for their own people. And it was only when professionalism came in the 1880s that football started to get a toehold amongst a much wider populace. So in that respect, I think England was a bit behind the curve in terms of the development of the game. And it took a bit of time to catch up with Scotland. So that's a sort of general summary of how I see it.
Just going back to those first internationals between England and Scotland, when international football came on the scene, did it eclipse the national cup competitions in any way, the FA Cup and the Scottish Cup, or were they still the main attractions for the respective nations?
I suppose it depends which nation it comes to be. Certainly in Scotland, the international football very quickly started drawing large crowds, so that the first international, 1872, got about 2,500, 3,000 people in Glasgow, and a similar figure back in London for the return. But by the mid-1870s, just 5 years afterwards or so, the Scotland-England game in Glasgow was getting 15,000, 20,000 people, whereas in London is much smaller numbers. At the same time, the Scottish Cup crowd figures were rising much more quickly than the English FA Cup. They were both very popular, and I don't think you can say that either of them eclipsed the other. Inevitably, a cup final only has the fans of two clubs who are interested in it, whereas the national team has the whole nation behind it. So I think for a long time, in particular when Scotland were beating England on a regular basis, the national team was very, very important. Club football caught up, but I think the two of them went hand in hand together. They were seen as very different experiences, important to different people for different reasons, but they all went hand in hand. And I can't say that international football was at the expense of the FA Cup or the other way around. They were all just part of the growth of the game.
Yeah, room for both.
Yes.
Now, the FA Cup was the only game in town for some time. However, that changed with the arrival of the Football League. Now, similar to the question above, did the arrival of the Football League, did it also maybe tarnish FA Cup, or was FA Cup still highly regarded?
I think that they have different appeal to different people, but the FA Cup in England, until even very recently, was the showpiece event of the season. And I think that was certainly the case in the Victorian era. The FA Cup final was the one that everybody wanted to be at. The league certainly fulfilled a need for regular top-class football, but I don't think it generated the same kind of passionate excitement of hysteria that an FA Cup final could do. And I think that's always been the case in football. Cup football just has that uncertainty and drama of this being your only chance. Whereas league football, if you lose a game, hey, there's always next week. So I think for many, many years in English and Scottish football, the National Cup was seen as more prestigious and more exciting than league titles. But they're both, of course, important in their own way.
Just sadly not to most Premier League teams these days.
Well, that has changed, obviously, quite recently. Yeah. The Premier League has now become a mega tournament, the best league in the world, and so on, through commercial influences. And that's just modern football. But if we're talking about the Victorian era, then I think my point stands.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, up until certainly the 80s, 90s, I think the FA Cup still had that status as well. I think, as you said, it's a fairly recent development that it's been slipped down in the list of priorities. And speaking of league football, it came a few years too late for Arthur Kinnaird's career. But how do you think personally that he would have coped with the league format?
I think as an amateur, he would have found it very difficult, purely for practical reasons, in that he had a full-time job. He would have found it difficult to get the time off, to commit to having to play every Saturday in a professional competition. And from the 1890s onwards, there were amateurs playing in the Football League, but very few. And it tended to be people like school teachers who didn't want to be sullied with the reputation of being a professional. So in that respect, a lot of the early amateurs who could pick and choose which games they played, sometimes they could pick and choose which clubs they played for, they would not have adapted well to the rigours of the Football League. And the other factor is, of course, playing style, in that Kinnaird came from a much more robust and, I suppose, uncompromising style, where kicking and pushing and shoving was part and parcel of the game. But once the Football League started, that was very quickly clamped down on, for the very pragmatic reason that footballers were assets. And if you allowed too much kicking and hacking within the game, then those expensive assets would be damaged and would not be able to play anymore. And that's been a continued theme for many years. And now any kind of tackle or physical contact is very risky in football. But even from the formation of the Football League, that was quite a key point. So in that respect as well, I don't think Kinnaird would have lasted 5 minutes in the Football League. He would have been off.
Also, a league format perhaps requires a regular traveling that maybe someone in a position of Arthur Kinnaird would not have been able to maintain given his work off the field.
Yeah, very likely. Although, if you look at his career, he did travel quite a lot. And there were a lot of games they would play either in the FA Cup or county teams or for select matches in Nottingham, Sheffield. They went on tours and so on. But these were games when they could, because it was an amateur team, they could pick and choose whether they played or not. I mean, to take one slightly incongruous example, in 1871-72, when the unofficial internationals were being played, and it was the first year of the FA Cup, Kinnaird was nowhere to be seen because he was on a tour of India visiting his mother's charitable concerns. So I don't think your average professional would have got away with that. So Kinnaird had other priorities in his life, and I don't think he could have committed to being a full-time professional, and certainly not with the rigours of having to play every week to earn a wage.
Just to familiarize myself, an FA Cup season, how long would the duration be? As far as how many months was it? Is it like today from January to May, or was it?
Well, the FA Cup started in September or October, and the football season's got longer over time. But generally speaking, in the early days, the FA Cup would start in October and it would finish in March. And that stretched from September to April. And as you know now, it's sort of July to May.
Oh, so, right. Yeah, I was thinking of the top league teams when I say January to May.
Yeah, because in those days, the top teams would still be entered in the first round, and there were no exemptions. That came a fair bit later when the numbers of clubs became so big. So in the 1880s, yes, you're right. The top teams would then start playing FA Cup ties generally in January, which gave time for all the small teams to be whittled down to a small number.
Did Kinnaird have any contact with the Football League founder, William McGregor, that you would know of?
Yes, he did. They were the same age. They were both with family roots in the same county in Scotland, in Perthshire. And albeit they had very different lives, in that Kinnaird was brought up in London into a very rich home and went to public school, whereas McGregor was brought up in a small village, went to school there, and then went to Birmingham to work in the clothing industry as a draper. But they certainly came into regular contact because McGregor was on the FA committees, the FA Council, for 20 years, from about 1990, 91 or thereabouts, until his death in 1911. And he sat on a number of different committees. So he would have been in regular contact at those meetings with Kinnaird, who by then was the president of the FA. Now, although Kinnaird himself didn't sit on many committee meetings as president, he certainly sat on the council meetings and would have got to know McGregor quite well. And in fact, one of McGregor's last experiences of the FA, just a month or two before his death in 1911, he was presented with the FA's Long Service Medal by Arthur Kinnaird to recognise 20 years on the FA Council. So, although I can't say how friendly they were or whether they went down the pub together afterwards, they were certainly very familiar with each other, and I'm sure had a great deal of mutual respect for what they had contributed to the development of football and the management of football.
So one of the fundamental issues that I suppose we've already touched on, but what's your explanation for why there was this huge struggle around professionalism? Why was it that being professional and earning money from playing the game was viewed as in some way unseemly? What were the cultural reasons behind that struggle to establish professionalism?
A lot of it went back to the Victorian class structure, which was very rigid, very difficult to move up and down the class structure without either making a lot of money or being lucky. And I think the main reason was that those who were in positions of power wanted to protect their positions. It was ever thus. And people within sport, it wasn't just football, the same in rugby and athletics and rowing, whatever, went to enormous lengths to protect their game as being amateur for those who could afford to participate rather than those who were paid to participate. And there were lots of ridiculous situations arising from that, of people who were once found to have won sixpence at a professional foot race and therefore were not allowed to play football for a club, and rather spurious reasons. But essentially the whole amateur professional divide was a means of people protecting their position and not having to mix with the riffraff. Now, football was fairly unusual in the respect that it agreed to recognise professionalism on equal terms. It wasn't unique because you had cricket, for example, which had professionals. But cricket professionals were very much treated as other people. They couldn't stay in the same hotels as the amateurs. Their names were listed differently on the scorecards with their initials either before or after the game, depending whether they're amateur or professional. There was this little secret code of who they were. Whereas in association football, once professionalism was recognised, very quickly all the top players were professionals. So that kind of distinction would have been meaningless. So I think people came to accommodate it. There were, though, those in football who wanted to guard their amateur status, and that lingered on in the south, in London and the home counties in particular, right up to the First World War. And this isn't probably part of this podcast, but from 1907 there was an amateur football breakaway, and vast numbers of amateur footballers refused to have anything to do with the FA because they wanted to keep their game pure. And there was personal ramifications for Arthur Kinnaird, by then Lord Kinnaird, because in 1907 he had to resign from the Old Etonian Football Club, which had decided to go in with the amateurs, and he was forced to find another club to associate with, and he went with London Caledonians. So even for a man like Kinnaird, that split between amateur and professionalism had some ramifications. But within the game, it was just one of these developmental things that finally settled down. But culturally, it was just, I suppose, snobbishness is the quickest way to describe it.
Arthur Kinnaird and many of the subjects we've just talked about were portrayed in the recent Netflix series, The English Game. Can you talk about your involvement with this series as far as how you approach what was asked of you or anything related that you would like to share?
Yeah, I was quite fortunate in that I published my biography of Arthur Kinnaird at the same time as this program was first being mooted. And in fact, the draft script was written about 15 years ago. That's how long it takes to get things sometimes bankrolled and onto the screen. So when I first wrote my book, I was contacted by a chap called Eddie Charlton, who had helped to write this screenplay, and met up with him. And I knew that this was in the offing for years before it actually did, in fact, get the go-ahead from Netflix. So in that respect, I was sort of ahead of the game in that I knew the people behind the program. So when they finally sold the idea to Netflix, who agreed to commission the 6-part series, which would be about a couple of years ago now, the program makers got in touch with me and said, would I like to advise on some of the content? By that time, the script was very much being written and fine-tuned. So it was a question of, I had one meeting. I went down to Manchester to meet with some of the crew, and the rest of it was just on the phone or by email, commenting on some of the scripts and answering questions about how the game would be played, how people might dress, what the crowd might shout, and so on. I didn't get involved in the script writing itself because that wasn't what they asked me to do. If I had, it would have been very different, I suspect. But then I'm not a dramatist. I'm not Julian Fellows. So that's why he's richer than me. And he can come up with a great storyline. I was there really to sort of maybe rein in some of the inaccuracies or historical elements of it that I thought were just incongruous. So that sums up what I did, without going into too many specifics.
Yeah, one of the talking points from the English Game, obviously especially amongst the football historians, was that there's a number of inconsistencies, as you say, whether for dramatic reasons or otherwise, and some factual errors, again, without posting any blame for that, but could you comment on that, some of the inconsistencies and errors? Was that a little bit frustrating to see those and not have any input necessarily?
Well, in one respect it was frustrating. As a historian, I like to see accurate facts. And when it came to watching the programme, I took the wise precaution of watching it with my wife, so that sort of stopped me from shouting at the screen too much. But also getting a different perspective, in that she quite enjoyed it as a drama, as a project. And by the end of the first episode, I was doing that too. So it's a good story. But for the same reason you wouldn't watch Downton Abbey for a rigorous investigation of class differences in a Victorian country house. This was a tale well told, with a basis on the truth, and it did tell the story of the first professionals coming to Lancashire and winning the FA Cup. And it involved a number of genuine people, real characters, and I think it made a great tale to watch. It was entertaining viewing, and if there were inaccuracies, and we could number all sorts of inaccuracies, I think most people take that with a pinch of salt. From my perspective, I think what it did do was get a lot of people interested in the early history of football. So for every history buff in football who said that's not who played Darwin, and it wasn't Blackburn Rovers, it was Blackburn Olympic, and so on and so on, you've got 100 other people who say, wow, that's really good. And I can measure that by a piece on my website, which I wrote about Jimmy Love a few years ago, about who he was and what he really, how his life panned out. Now, Jimmy Love is a fairly obscure person in football history. He doesn't even have a Wikipedia page, which really means you have to be obscure not to be a footballer and not have a Wikipedia page. So my blog piece was pretty much the only source of information about him. But in the week after the English game went live, my website, which used to get about 30, 40 hits a day, was getting 4,000 or 5,000 hits a day. And the vast majority of those people had Googled Jimmy Love, Fergie Souter, and had been driven to my website. And that's how they got their information. And I got a lot of very nice comments from people saying, well, that's really good. I'm glad to read the true story and find out what happened. So although the story of the English game maybe didn't have that historical accuracy that some people demanded, what it did do was got people interested, and the end effect was a lot more people know about Arthur Kinnaird, about Fergie Souter, Jimmy Love, about the story of Darwin. And I think that is far more beneficial than quibbling too much about the specific inaccuracies of the story.
Without getting into the historical inaccuracies, as you call them, do you think the show itself, it provided an accurate atmosphere, accurate vibe of the football and life conditions of the day?
I think so. I wasn't around in the 1870s, so I can't say what it was like to work in a cotton mill, but that's very much the expertise of the screenwriters, the scriptwriters, and how they did their screenplay. And they put a huge amount of effort into getting things right, that people wore the right kind of clothes, that they said the right kind of things. So in that respect, yes, I think it did capture the flavour of life in Lancashire in the 1870s, 1880s. And I thought it was absolutely fascinating to see football as it was imagined to be played, and I think they generally got it pretty right. You had the two conflicting styles of the old Etonians trying to force their way through, forming a kind of wing formation to bludgeon their way through the opposition defence. And then Darwin kicking the ball about and passing around this block of the old Etonians coming at them. So I think in that respect it was pretty accurate. And I haven't heard too many complaints about people saying that the depiction of the football was wrong. I think it was right. And the same about life in Darwin and in Blackburn. I think that was pretty good too. So if you look at the programme in the round, I think it was a great success. And all credit to the filmmakers for achieving that.
And even down to the uniforms of the players and things as such, it looks authentic enough, I'm assuming, right?
Yes.
The long pants and all that.
Yes. They had their own costume department making these football strips and making all the other paraphernalia. And I had a huge series of emails and questions about what would a linesman's flag look like, or what kind of whistle would they use, and when would they use it? What would shin pads be like? Would they be worn inside or outside the socks? So I was able to explain how a lot of these things operated. And of course, football was still developing at that time. You had an umpire, certainly you had a referee standing at the side of the pitch in his top hat, and maybe a couple of umpires on the pitch. But generally speaking, they didn't use the whistle very much. They used it to start and finish the game, but you didn't blow for a foul. They waved a flag in the air. So I was able to explain some of these practicalities of how the game would be played. And for instance, the conditions of play. What kind of crowds would you have? What would they shout? What kind of pitch would they play on? What were the markings? And of course, there weren't any markings in those days. The grass was deliberately left long. There wasn't some kind of manicured pitch like you get today. So if you look at the series, you can see that the grass is quite long, rough, and there's no goal nets. It's just goal posts. So in all those respects, they put a lot of effort into getting it right. And I can only pay credit to them for that.
Every entertainment piece has to have a dramatic narrative that drives the story forward. And you have to sometimes rely on cliches such as class struggle to drive the story forward. But the main takeaways from you, at least what I seem to gather, is that it renewed an interest of that historical era of football, which you praise.
Yeah, that's right. And as I said, I can quantify that from the number of visitors I had to my website. I can quantify it from the number of books I sold. A biography of Kinnaird, for example, which had a very nice upturn in sales figures. So I think it has generated a lot of interest, and overwhelmingly people have enjoyed watching it. And I think the specifics of the history are lost on some people, which I'm not going to get too upset about. When the Lancashire Cotton Riots happened in 1878, the year before they portrayed it, but who cares? They happened, and Colonel Jackson's house was indeed burned down. So they're portraying life as it was at that time. And whilst I know that Jimmy Love didn't break his leg, because by then he'd already gone off to join the army and he died of disease in Egypt, which is a tale in itself, but for dramatic purposes, it made sense to keep him in Darwin, get married to the local girl, and become part of the action throughout the programme. So I'm not upset by that, and if anybody should be upset, it would be me. So I don't really get all the objections that people have to the programme's inaccuracies, because they don't really matter at the end of the day when you're watching a TV drama on Netflix.
And given the success of the series, I don't know if you can comment on this anyway, but if there was to be a sequel, who do you think would be the central character, and what themes might it develop from that first series?
Well, I can't comment on about because I don't know. I would be delighted if they did do a follow-up, and I think the audience figures were pretty good, the reaction was pretty good. How that translates to commercial viability is not for me to say. That's really for people to put their ideas to Netflix and Netflix to decide what they're going to make money out of. My own suggestions for another series, I wouldn't just continue the action, because I think that whole episode of the first professionals and then getting to the state of winning the FA Cup is a story in itself. Now, you could continue on for a few more years as they keep on winning FA Cups and then form the Football League. You could have the struggle for professionalism. But whether that would make a drama that would have worldwide appeal, I'm not so sure. I think if they're going to do another one on the history of football, they could pick, for example, the story of the first World Cup with Jules Rimet and the voyage across the Atlantic, the whole build-up through the Olympics of the 1920s, right up to what happened in Uruguay in 1930. Or they could go for the first women's football teams. A fantastic story about the British Ladies Football Club in the 1890s and how they got going and went on tour and what they had to put up with. I think that'd be a fabulous drama. Or even what happens to women's football after the First World War, leading up to the ban. But football's fantastic. I mean, you've got so many different topics that you could pick and choose. You could pick the first black footballers. You could pick the first football coming to the USA or going around the world, whatever. There's a whole range of stories. But somebody has to write a good screenplay and then pitch it to filmmakers. That's how these things work. And then you keep your fingers crossed and wait to see what happens.
Just about all your writing deals with an era of football in its early years that most of the public might not know about. What sparked your interest to this era of football?
Oh, that's a long story. I think I've always been interested in history. And in terms of the early years of football, it just seemed such an untapped resource. I mean, I started getting involved in football history 40 years ago. I'm fascinated by the characters involved in football. And the further back you go, the more interesting they get, because they had lives outside of football. There's a huge variety of different people. So the fascination for me is just the same as anyone. It's human interest and finding out about the lives. So that particular era is just something I've come to specialize in. And there was so much that wasn't known about the early days of football. Or to put it another way, there were so many facts that were accepted as being true, but in fact weren't. So it's possible now to go into digitized archives, digitized newspapers and so on, and actually establish what the true story was. So my speciality, I suppose, is finding out about people and finding out who they really were. And there's a lot more to do, but I've managed to get several books out of my own fascination, and hopefully that has helped to, encourage other people to get interested and to set the record straight at the same time.
Since there are no living witnesses, can you briefly describe your research process?
Yeah, it depends who I'm looking at, but I go down, if I'm researching people, there are two strong threads. One is to obviously search the online newspapers, and the best site for that is the British Newspaper Archive, and you can find out a lot about people's lives in that respect, whether it's football or non-football, but also through genealogy, and that if you can find the records of people in censuses, in birth records, in private genealogy records, you can develop an awful lot of information about people. So there's no one way to set out to research a subject or an individual person. You have to spread it as widely as possible. And I just enjoy that whole process about finding out about people. That's it in a nutshell.
And is there anything that you're working on at the moment, or any area that you'd maybe like to explore in the future that maybe you feel you haven't got round to yet?
Well, at the moment, my main project, which is nearly finished, I'm glad to say, is a who's who of Scotland internationalists. It's not the first time that anyone's attempted this by any means. But there were a lot of early players in particular who very little was known about. And in some cases, I've found out that people have been allocated a cap in records, whereas in fact they didn't win it, or the other way around. So the records are wrong. So I've done a complete who's who of Scotland internationalists up to the Second World War, which is effectively the early period, so over 600 players. And I managed to identify every single one of those. I'm waiting for a few archives to reopen after the COVID closures, because there are a few things I need to check and to finalize. But that'll be my next publication. And I know it's very niche, but I think it's important that if somebody was good enough to play for their country, that we should actually know who these people were and which games they played in. So that's my main thing. But at the same time, I've got a website, Scottish Sport History, which has a very broad remit. Happily, it's non-commercial. I can write about whatever I like. And I've always got little projects on the go, whether it's stories of individuals, not just in football, but in a range of other sports. I'm fascinated by the early black or ethnic minority sports people in Scotland. And again, some of whom are very obscure or very unknown people. And I think there's a lot of good stories that need to be told about their lives and how they came to be accepted in society and how they managed to make their way in football. But I can often find myself going off on a complete tangent because of something I see on Twitter in the morning, and then I spend half the morning finding out if this was true or not, or whether it's there's something more interesting to that. So in that respect, I'm my own boss. I can pick and choose what I do.
I'm curious to know if you ever contact the living descendants of some of these players just to maybe get an idea, maybe even old photographs, if that's even possible. Do you ever approach this way?
Yes, I do. And it's a very important way of getting information. It doesn't always work, but when I'm researching somebody in depth, one of the first things I do is draw up a family tree, not just going backwards to find out their own background and their parents and what they did, but also, if possible, tracking it down to the present day. And I've had a lot of contact with the descendants of football players and other sportsmen, because you'd be amazed how many of them have some kind of relic or information or photos that they can share with you. And the best example of that is Arthur Kinnaird. When I was setting out to write his story, I had a fair bit of information. He's a fairly well-known guy. But I got in touch with his great-great-granddaughter, and who was a bit unsure at first what I was trying to find out, but eventually said, well, come up to the house and we can discuss it. And when I was there, she said, oh, there's a box of things here you might like to have a look through. And that was just like the greatest discovery, because there was a large box full of family papers, including photos of Kinnaird, some of his documentation, letters he'd written, sadly not his FA Cup medals, which have long disappeared. But that kind of discovery is absolutely essential to really getting to the bottom of any individual. And I've had this quite a few times of tracking down people that they have priceless relics that they don't know are of any great interest. Another example for Kinnaird International in 1873. I found the descendant of one of the other players who had the match card from that game, which are used as an illustration in my books. So that's the oldest known match card for any football match. So that just goes to show what we can come up with. But I think it's great to contact descendants. So yeah, I'd heartily recommend it if you can. Every now and then you get a knockback, or people say, I don't know anything, or I know plenty, but I'm not going to tell you. But that's pretty rare. So I will keep on persevering on that line.
Arthur Kinnaird is referred to by many historians the very first star of football. Do you agree with that statement?
Yes, I do. And that's why I called my book The First Lord of Football. Not just a pun on him being Lord Kinnaird, but he was genuinely the most prominent player of his day. He was described in the Football Annual, without exception, the best player of the day. So that was 1873. They were aware of his greatness, his position in football. But if you add to that his character, all the other things he did in his life, teaching slum kids to read and being involved, just a vast number of different projects outside football. He was a very recognizable figure. He had a bushy red beard, so you could spot him from a distance. You always knew which one was Kinnaird if you're watching football. So, yeah, he was the superstar of the day. And you saw that at the start of the English game where a couple of boys asked him for his autograph. Now, I don't think people did that particularly, but that, for me, encapsulates the fact that he was very well known, much admired. And he devoted his life to football, but I think football people were devoted to him as well, which is how he had such longevity in the game, and his whole life revolved around football. He was, yeah, the seminal figure of the Victorian age.
With that, thank you for your participation. It's been a very good discussion and kind of opened our eyes to an era of football that is not all too familiar to most historians. Discussing this with you has, sparked my interest even more to dive in more, to find out more of this era. So again, I want to thank you for participating in this interview and this very good discussion.
Sean and Paul, it's been a pleasure. So thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.
If anyone wants to leave questions and comments, you can do it on the blog posting. You may contact me on Twitter at SP1873, as well as my blog, Soccer Nostalgia, or on Facebook under Soccer Nostalgia. Mr. Paul Whittle can be contacted on Twitter at 1888letter. Mr. Mitchell is on Twitter at Andy Mitch Media, and also visit his website, scottishsportshistory.com. Again, all this information is listed on the blog and the Spotify posting. And you may also follow us on Spotify under Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. Once again, Mr. Mitchell, thank you very much, and look forward to your future work.
Thank you, and goodbye.
Thank you.